The needle of Pearl Sawyer's compass had been spinning freely for 3 days, pointing nowhere and everywhere at once. And it was only when she crested the final ridge of the Rocky Mountains on a gray October morning in 1882 and saw a valley stretched below her like a rumpled green blanket that she understood she had no idea where on God's earth she had ended up. She pulled her mare, a sorrel named Duchess, to a halt and stood in the stirrups, pressing one hand against the small of her back where 6 weeks of hard riding had settled into a permanent, dull ache. The valley below was beautiful in the particular way that wild and untouched land is beautiful, not arranged or composed the way a painting might be, but raw and accidental and breathing. A creek threaded silver through the bottom of it. Pines crowded the slopes on either side, broken here and there by open meadows the color of old straw. And at the valley's center, where the land flattened into something hospitable, there was a ranch. A proper one, not just a dugout or a soddy, but a log house with a real porch, a barn, 3 outbuildings, and a cluster of corrals where small shapes that had to be horses moved slowly in the morning chill. Pearl had started in Denver. She had intended to reach Boise, Idaho, where her Aunt Clara lived, and had written her a letter promising a room and steady work as a seamstress. That letter was still folded in Pearl's coat pocket, the paper worn soft as cloth from a month of being read and reread whenever doubt crept in. The compass, borrowed from her neighbor Mr. Hatch before she departed, had worked fine through the foothills. It was somewhere past the Arkansas headwaters, when she had taken what she thought was a northwest track, that the needle had begun to drift. By the time she noticed the problem with any real alarm, the mountains had closed around her like a fist, and there was nothing to do but follow the logic of terrain, rivers running downhill, passes where the snow had not yet settled too deep, the sun's position when the clouds allowed her to see it. She had eaten badly and slept worse. She had forded 3 rivers that frightened her more than she would admit to any living person. She had spent one night in a canyon so narrow and dark that the walls blocked the stars, and she had talked to Duchess the entire night, not because she thought the horse understood her, but because the sound of her own voice kept the silence from becoming crushing. She was 26 years old and from the hill country of Missouri, and she was, by any honest measure, completely and spectacularly lost. But there was smoke coming from the chimney of that ranch house below, and she had not spoken to another human being in 11 days, and so she gathered her reins and started Duchess down the slope. The land at the bottom of the valley was firmer than she expected, the grass thick and well-watered. She passed a fence line made of split rails, then another of barbed wire, that relatively new and controversial invention that ranchers out west had been adopting with arguments both for and against, and she followed a beaten track through dried mud until she reached the front yard of the ranch house. She was perhaps 20 feet from the porch steps when the front door opened and a man came out. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that bore several days of dark stubble. He wore canvas work pants, suspenders over a flannel shirt the color of pine needles, and boots that had seen serious use. In one hand he carried a tin coffee mug. He stopped on the top step and looked at her with an expression that was not quite alarm and not quite welcome, something measured and careful in between. Pearl stopped Duchess and straightened in the saddle, because whatever state she was in, she had been raised to present herself with dignity. "Good morning," she said. He studied her for a long moment. His eyes were dark brown or black. She could not tell in the gray light, and they moved from her face to Duchess's heaving flanks to the pack roll behind the saddle to the rifle she carried in the scabbard and back to her face again, with the methodical attention of a man who assessed things before he committed to a position. "Morning," he said. "You are on my property." "I suspect I am," Pearl said, "and I apologize for that. I would explain how I came to be here, but the explanation is somewhat embarrassing." Something shifted in his expression. It was not a smile exactly, but it was adjacent to one. "Try me," he said. Pearl reached into the inner pocket of her coat and produced the compass. She held it up, the cracked glass face catching what little light the morning offered, the needle spinning in slow, useless circles. I borrowed this from my neighbor before I left Denver. He told me it was his best one. The man looked at the compass. He looked at it for several seconds. Then he looked at her again, and now there was something in his expression that she could only describe as deeply resigned amusement, the kind a person wears when the world has offered them something so absurd they have no choice but to accept it. "You crossed the Rockies with that." "I did," Pearl said. "Alone. Entirely." He stepped down off the porch. He moved like a man who was accustomed to covering ground without wasted motion, and he came to stand beside Duchess and look up at Pearl, which put his face closer to hers than she had expected. Up close, she could see that his eyes were brown, and that there were lines around them from squinting into outdoor light for many years, and that the careful expression had not left them. "That explains," he said, "why you ended up on my property. Does it help if I mention that I made very good time regardless? How long did it take you? 43 days from Denver." He blinked. "Most men doing that route on horseback take 30. Pearl looked at him calmly. "I went by a somewhat indirect path." He stared at her for another moment, and then, quite suddenly, he laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it changed his whole face, opened it up, and Pearl found herself holding very still the way you hold still when a deer walks into a clearing, and you do not want to frighten it away. The laugh passed, but the openness remained for a few seconds before the careful look settled back into place. "Silas Lawson," he said, extending his hand. She took it. His grip was firm and calloused and honest. "Pearl Sawyer." "Where are you trying to get to, Miss Sawyer?" "Boise, Idaho. My aunt lives there." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. "You are in Wyoming territory," he said. "You are about 300 miles south and east of Boise." Pearl absorbed this. She looked at the mountains behind her, then at the valley, then at Silas Lawson's face. "Well," she said after a moment, "that is quite a correction to make." "It is," he agreed. He looked at Duchess. "Your horse needs water and rest before she can carry you anywhere at all, and by the look of you the same applies." "I am perfectly capable of—" "I have no doubt about your capabilities, Miss Sawyer," he said, and there was nothing condescending in it, just a flat statement of practicality. "But capable people still need water and rest. My housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, will be here by 8. You are welcome to breakfast and a proper place to sleep before you figure out your next move. That is all I am offering. The choice is yours." Pearl looked at him. She was very hungry, and the ache in her back had spread to her hips, and she could not honestly remember the last time she had eaten a hot meal. "Thank you," she said. "I accept." He took Duchess's bridle and led the horse toward the barn without ceremony, and Pearl slid from the saddle and followed on legs that had forgotten what flat ground felt like. The barn was large and well kept, smelling of hay and horses and the particular dry warmth of animals sheltered from the wind. 3 other horses occupied stalls, a big gray, a bay gelding, and a black and white paint, and they watched Pearl with the mild philosophical interest that horses generally extended to strangers. Silas found Duchess a stall, stripped her saddle and tack with practiced efficiency, and began rubbing her down with a worn cloth. "You do not have a ranch hand?" Pearl asked. "I do." 2. They are out checking the upper fence line. Cattle got into the timber 2 days ago, and I need to know where the breach is before the snow sets in. Work the cloth along Duchess's neck without pausing. "Do you know cattle?" "No. I know horses, and I know how to set a broken finger, and I can bake a pie that has won 2 county fair ribbons, but cattle are beyond my education." He looked at her sideways. "Missouri. Is it that obvious? The accent, and the county fair ribbons." He finished with Duchess and gave the horse a measure of grain from a barrel near the wall. "I am originally from Texas myself. Before that my family was from Tennessee." Pearl watched him move through the barn, checking water levels in the stalls with the automatic thoroughness of a man whose rhythms were entirely shaped by the land he lived on. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 7 years. I came up with a trail herd in '75 and decided not to go back south." He paused. "The valley was open range then. I filed on it in '76. It is a fine valley, Pearl said. It is, he said. There was something in how he said it quietly, with a solemnness that suggested the place meant more to him than a man who was simply good at what he did would ordinarily reveal. The farmhouse interior was plain but not crude. The main room had a stone fireplace already burning, a plank table with 4 chairs, an oak sideboard and bookshelves along one wall that held perhaps 30 books. Pearl noticed them immediately, and with a feeling that was almost tender, 30 books in a ranch house, 300 miles from the nearest city, was not a small thing. There was a braided rug on the floor, and the windows were real glass, not oiled paper, and the whole place had the feeling of being inhabited by someone who had made deliberate choices about how to live. Silas poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the iron stove and set a plate of cold biscuits and a jar of preserved plums on the table. "Best I can do until Mrs. Alderton arrives," he said. Pearl sat down and ate with a composure she was frankly proud of, because what she wanted to do was fall on the food like she had not eaten in a week, which was not far from accurate. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, and the best thing she had tasted since somewhere east of the mountains. She ate 3 biscuits and half the jar of plums, and then sat with her hands around her coffee mug and looked at the fire. Silas sat across from her and did not speak, which she appreciated. He was not the kind of man who felt obligated to fill silence, and after 43 days largely alone, Pearl had developed a deep respect for people who understood the value of quiet. After a while she said, "The books, do you read them?" He looked up from the fire. "All of them, some twice." "Which one is your favorite?" He considered this the way he seemed to consider most things, without rushing. "Thoreau," he said. "Walden, do you know it?" "I do." She looked at the shelf. "I would not have expected that." "What would you have expected?" She thought about it honestly. "Perhaps something on cattle management." He almost smiled again. "I have one of those too. But it does not keep me company the same way." Mrs. Alderton arrived at 8:15. A solid woman in her late 50s with gray hair pulled back without apology and sharp blue eyes that took in Pearl sitting at the table, with the rapid comprehension of someone who had seen most things and classified them quickly. She listened to Silas's brief explanation: lost traveler, broken compass, needs rest and a meal, with an expression that moved from assessment to decision without lingering in between. "You look like you have not slept properly in 2 weeks, she said to Pearl without preamble. "Something in that neighborhood," Pearl admitted. "I will put the spare room to rights. You sleep as long as you need. I will bring food up when you wake." She said this with the authority of someone issuing orders to an army, and Pearl, who had been told all her life that she had a difficult personality on account of her stubbornness, felt absolutely no inclination to argue. The spare room had a real bed with a rope frame and a proper mattress stuffed with what felt like wool, and 2 wool blankets, and Pearl lay down on top of them still in her clothes, and was asleep before she had finished the thought that she should probably remove her boots. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke it was full dark outside, and there was a lamp burning low on the small table by the bed, and on that table sat a bowl of venison stew covered with a cloth to keep it warm, a glass of water, and a fresh biscuit. She sat up, and the soreness in her whole body made itself known all at once like an orchestra arriving at the dramatic moment of a symphony, and she sat for several minutes simply breathing through it before she pulled off her boots, smoothed her hair with her fingers as best she could, and ate the stew. It was excellent stew. Pearl sat with the empty bowl and the water glass and the last half of the biscuit and listened to the house. Somewhere below she heard the low sound of a man's voice, and then quiet, and then the house settled into the particular silence of a place well built against the wind, and she could hear that too, moving through the pines outside with a long, rolling sound like distant water. She slept again, properly this time, and dreamed nothing she remembered. In the morning she came downstairs to find Mrs. Alderton making sourdough at the table and the house empty of Silas, and she washed her face and hands in the basin by the back door and sat at the table and asked if there was something she could do to help, because idleness had always made her restless. Mrs. Alderton looked at her. "Can you cook?" "Well enough for a single woman with nowhere to be." "Better than Silas." "Almost certainly," Pearl said, with more confidence than she had any real right to, and Mrs. Alderton made a sound that was either approval or amusement and slid a bowl of dried beans across the table at her and told her to sort them. She was still sorting beans when Silas came in an hour later, stamping mud from his boots at the back door, with his hat pushed back on his head and his cheeks red from the cold. He stopped when he saw her, and she saw something move across his face, surprise maybe, or something that surprise was covering for, and then he crossed to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup and sat down across the table from her. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like someone drove a wagon over me," Pearl said, "but better than yesterday." "The breach in the upper fence was about 40 yards, he said, as if continuing a conversation they had already started. "Frost Heave took out 3 posts. My men are resetting them today." Pearl nodded, not quite sure why he was telling her this, and also finding, to her own mild surprise, that she was genuinely interested. "I need to think about my route," she said, "to Boise. If I can get to the nearest town, I can ask at the livery or the general store about the best way through." Silas set his coffee cup down. "The nearest town is Harlow Creek, 12 miles north. There is a stage line that runs through it once a week on Tuesdays. Today is Saturday." Pearl did the arithmetic. "So I have 3 days." "You have 3 days," he confirmed. "And you are welcome to remain here until the stage, if you want a safer option than riding alone again with a compass that does not function." She looked at him across the table. He said things without embellishment. She was learning not because he lacked feeling, but because he seemed to regard the simple statement of facts as a sufficient and honest form of hospitality. There was something she found deeply calming about this, and she had been calmed by very few things in her 26 years which had contained their share of turbulence. "What would I owe you for that?" she asked. "Nothing. You are a traveler in need of rest. I have the room." He looked at her steadily. "There is no ledger here, Miss Sawyer." Pearl looked back at him. "There is always a ledger," she said quietly. Something in his expression shifted, became thoughtful. "Maybe so," he said. "But not always a punishing one." She did stay the 3 days. She told herself it was purely practical, and in a way it was, but it was also true that she found herself in no hurry to leave, which was a strange thing to notice about a place she had arrived at entirely by accident. On the first day, she helped Mrs. Alderton with the bread and put up 2 quarts of the remaining apples from the cellar. And in the afternoon, she walked out to the corrals and watched Silas work a young horse. A leggy chestnut, no more than 3 years old, who had opinions about the saddle that he expressed with energy. She leaned on the fence rail and watched him work with a patience that was the same patience she had noticed in everything else he did, steady and unhurried, without cruelty, speaking to the horse in a low, continuous voice that seemed to carry meaning even when the words themselves were unremarkable. He noticed her watching. He did not stop working, but he said, "You ride well. How can you tell from across a corral? The way you sat in the saddle when you rode in. You were exhausted, but you were still balanced. A lot of men lose their seat when they are tired. You did not." Pearl considered this. "My father taught me," she said. "He died when I was 15. He always said that a woman who could ride and shoot and read a map was harder to take advantage of than a woman who could only do the things women were supposed to do." Silas looked at her then directly. "He sounds like a sensible man." "He was," Pearl said. "He was also wrong about the map thing, apparently, given that I ended up here." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "He might have been right about the map and wrong about the compass. Those are different skills." Pearl felt something warm move through her chest at that, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it. So she watched him go back to work with the horse and said nothing else. And the afternoon light came down through the pines at a long angle and made the whole corral gold. On the second day, one of Silas's ranch hands, a young man named Cutter, who was perhaps 20, and had the enthusiastic openness of a person who had not yet been discouraged by the world. Brought news from Harlow Creek that there had been trouble at the Bentley homestead, 6 miles east. A fence dispute had turned ugly, as fence disputes in Wyoming territory had been turning with increasing frequency since the big cattlemen's associations had started using barbed wire to claim land they had no legal right to close off. The smaller homesteaders and the families trying to build something on free land were caught in the middle of it, and the law, such as it was, tended to bend toward those with money and influence. Pearl listened to Cutter's account from the kitchen doorway and watched Silas's face go still and hard in the way that faces go still and hard when a person knows a wrong is happening and is calculating what they can do about it. "Is Bentley hurt?" Silas asked. "Just roughed up. 2 of the association men came by, told him the fence he put up last spring was on their grazing land. He said it was not. He has the survey papers. They pulled his fence posts and rode off." Silas set down the leather harness he had been mending and stood. "I am going over there." "Silas," Mrs. Alderton said from the stove, with the tone of a woman who knew arguing was futile but felt obligated to register her concern. "I will not start anything," he said. "But Bentley is alone over there, and he has been working that land since '78, and he has every right to his fence." He pulled his coat from the hook. "Cutter, saddle the gray." Pearl had been quiet through all of this. She said, "I would like to come." Everyone in the kitchen looked at her. Silas's expression was complicated. She could see him measuring the risk against the indignity of telling a self-evidently capable woman that she could not go where she chose. "It could be nothing," he said carefully. "It could be," Pearl agreed. "But 2 men against 1 is not good arithmetic. 3 is better." There was a silence. Then Silas said, "Can you actually shoot that rifle, or is it decorative?" "I can hit a fence post at 100 yards, Pearl said. "I have demonstrated this several times in the last 6 weeks, mostly at rabbits, but the principle is the same." He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded once and went to the door. Pearl went to get her coat. The Bentley homestead was a modest affair, a small log house, a sodded barn, a kitchen garden that had been harvested for the season, and the remains of a fence line where several posts had been pulled and flung aside. George Bentley was a lean man in his late 40s, sitting on his porch with a rag pressed to a cut above his eye and the expression of someone who had been told their dignity was negotiable. He looked up when Silas rode in, and some of the tightness went out of his shoulders. "Lawson," he said. "George." Silas dismounted and walked up to the porch. "How bad is it?" "The cut is nothing. My pride is worse." Bentley looked at Pearl with undisguised curiosity. "Pearl Sawyer," she said from horseback. "I am passing through. I am sorry about your fence." Bentley seemed to accept this without needing further explanation, which Pearl thought said something about what life on the frontier did to a person's relationship with coincidence. "They said they will come back with the association lawyer. Said my survey was wrong." "Is it?" Bentley produced a folded document from his shirt pocket. "Filed in Cheyenne, 1878. My northeast corner is exactly where I put it." Silas looked at the document, then folded it carefully and handed it back. "Keep that on your person and do not let them see it until there is a witness present, preferably the sheriff. If they come back before you can get to Harlow Creek, you send for me." "The association has most of the sheriff's attention," Bentley said, and there was a bitterness in it that was earned and specific. "I know it," Silas said, "but the law is still the law, even if it is not always followed. And there are more small ranchers and homesteaders in this valley than there are association men. We outnumber them if we choose to." Pearl watched this exchange and felt something that she had not expected to feel, something like respect so immediate and grounded that it was almost startling. She had met men who talked about fairness and men who practiced it, and the gap between those 2 groups was, in her experience, the size of the Rocky Mountains. Silas Lawson was a man who practiced it, quietly and without speech-making, and she found this more compelling than she had any practical reason to. They stayed an hour, helped George reset 4 of the fence posts, and rode back to the Lawson Ranch in the late afternoon with the sky going pink and orange over the western peaks in that extravagant way Wyoming Territory skies had of ending a day. They rode for a while in silence. Then Pearl said, "Does that happen often?" "It has been getting worse for 2 years," Silas said. "The big associations want the open range back. They do not like that smaller outfits are homesteading and fencing. They have money and lawyers and friends in the territorial government. The small people have their survey papers and not much else." "And which are you?" He thought about that. "Neither, exactly. I have a proper land claim and enough cattle to be taken seriously, but not enough to be invited to their table, which suits me well enough." "Does it not make you a target?" "Sometimes," he said, "but I am not easily moved." Pearl looked at him riding beside her in the fading light, his hat brim cutting a straight line against the sky, and thought that this was probably the most accurate thing he had said since she arrived. On the third day it snowed. Not much, 2 inches by mid-morning. Not enough to close the mountain passes or make travel impossible, but enough to make the ranch look like something from an illustration in a book. The fence line softened, and the pine branches bowing under white weight and the creek still running dark between white banks. Pearl stood on the porch with her coffee and watched it and felt something she had trouble naming. A kind of reluctance that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the particular quality of the past 3 days, which had been unlike anything she had experienced in a long time. Silas came out behind her. He stood beside her and looked at the snow for a while without speaking. "The stage still runs in light snow," he said eventually. "I know," she said. There was a silence between them that felt different from the earlier silences, fuller, more weighted, as if it contained something that neither of them was quite willing to say aloud yet. "Your aunt is expecting you," Silas said. "She is." Pearl looked at the mountains. "I wrote to her from Denver. I told her I would be there before October ended. It is now past the middle of the month. She will worry. She will." Pearl wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "I should send a telegram from Harlow Creek. They have a telegraph office." Another silence. A bird moved through the snow and the pine at the edge of the yard, sending a small cascade of white off a branch. "Miss Sawyer," Silas said. He paused. Pearl waited. He started again with the careful deliberateness of someone who has something to say and is holding themselves to precision. "I realize we have known each other 3 days, and 2 of those days you spent mostly asleep or sorting beans, so perhaps it is generous to call it knowing each other at all. But I find myself," he stopped. "I find this house considerably less." He stopped again. He was not a man who struggled with words generally, Pearl had noticed, which made the struggling significant. Pearl turned to look at him. He was looking straight ahead at the snow, the line of his jaw set in the slightly pained way of a man who is forcing himself to say something honest. "Silas," she said. She had not used his first name before. It came out quietly. He looked at her then. "I know what you are trying to say," she said. "I am trying not to say it too." Something moved in his face, relief, maybe, or the particular relief of being understood without having to explain. "Are you succeeding?" "Not entirely," she admitted. He looked at her for a long moment. The snow was coming down in small, fine flakes, almost more like mist than snow, settling on Pearl's hair where it had come loose from its pins. Silas reached out and, with a care that was almost formal, brushed a small accumulation of snow from her shoulder. It was the lightest possible touch, barely contact, and yet Pearl felt it with a disproportionate intensity that she thought was probably the sort of thing that changed the direction of a life. "I am not asking you to stay," he said. "I am not the kind of man who asks things like that of someone he has known 3 days. I think it would be dishonest, and more than that, I think it would be unfair to you. You have a destination and a reason and an aunt who is waiting." "Yes," Pearl said, "but I would like," he paused. "I would like very much to know if there is any chance you might come back this way, at some point, of your own choosing and for your own reasons. And if you did, you would find," he looked at the house, at the valley, at her. "You would find the room available." Pearl looked at him for a long time. "The sensible thing, the safe thing. The thing her Aunt Clara and probably every woman of her acquaintance would advise was to say something non-committal and get on the stage and not look back. Sense and safety were things Pearl Sawyer had always understood theoretically while also maintaining a complicated relationship with in practice. "You should know," she said, "that I intend to reach Boise. I have a responsibility to my aunt and she has been kind to me when she did not have to be, and I will not abandon that responsibility." "I would not respect you if you did," Silas said. But Pearl continued, and she watched his eyes. "I have been alone for a long time, not just these 6 weeks. Longer than that, and I am very good at being alone. I am not certain I want to remain so indefinitely." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long do you think you will stay in Boise?" Pearl almost smiled. "I think that depends on certain variables I have not yet fully evaluated." "That is a very careful answer." "I am practicing," she said. "You are quite good at it, and I thought I might try." He did smile then, fully and without reservation, and it struck Pearl with the same force it had the first time, that opening up of his face, that unlocking, and she thought that a man whose smile was that guarded and therefore that valuable was a man worth some amount of consideration. She went to Harlow Creek on the stage the next morning. Silas rode with her to the stage depot, which was nothing more than a weathered building with a bench out front and a tired man inside who sold tickets and chewing tobacco with equal indifference. He helped her with her pack roll, tied Duchess to the back of the stage. The horse would be stabled in Boise's livery. Silas had insisted, which was safer than riding the horse further in the approaching winter, and stood by the stage door when it was time for her to board. Pearl had her ticket in one hand and her hat in the other, and she was looking at Silas with an expression she was not entirely managing to control. "Write to me," he said, "when you get there and you are settled and you have had time to think." "I will," she said. "There is no obligation in it," he said with that directness of his. "I only want to know you arrived safely." "I know there is no obligation," she said. "I said I will write. I meant it." He nodded. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he said, quietly enough that the stage driver could not have heard it, "I am glad your compass was broken, Pearl Sawyer." She stepped up into the stage. She turned in the doorway and looked at him standing in the cold morning light outside the weathered building, hat in his hand now, his dark hair ruffled by the wind off the mountain, his face open in the way it went open only when he was not guarding it. "So am I," she said. And she went inside, and the door closed and the stage lurched forward, and she did not look out the window because if she did she was not confident she would stay in the stage. She thought about him all the way to Boise. The stage journey was long and uncomfortable, as stage journeys invariably were in 1882. The roads through the Wyoming and Idaho territories were rough at the best of times, and the transition of seasons made them rougher, and Pearl spent the better part of 3 days being jostled against the other passengers, a drummer in a too-small suit and a Mormon family of 4 who were polite and very quiet. She was grateful for the quiet. She had a great deal to think about. Her Aunt Clara was a small, sharp-edged woman of 52 who had come west with her late husband in 1869 and stayed after his death from a fever in 1874, with what Pearl's mother had always called an incomprehensible stubbornness, and what Pearl had always privately thought of as an admirable refusal to let the geography of grief dictate the geography of life. Clara had built a successful seamstress business in Boise and had a house with a proper garden and opinions on everything, and she met Pearl at the stage depot with an expression that moved rapidly from relief to assessment to a kind of sharp attention that Pearl had been the subject of since childhood. "You are late," Clara said. "I went the wrong way," Pearl said. "There was a compass involved." Clara looked at her. "There is something different about you. I crossed the Rocky Mountains alone. I suspect that does something to a person." "That is not what I mean," Clara said, with the precision of a woman who meant exactly what she said and did not appreciate approximations. "But we can talk about it later. Come and have supper." Pearl went and had supper, and it was a very good supper, and afterward she sat at Clara's kitchen table and told her aunt the whole story, including the broken compass and the valley and the ranch house and Silas Lawson. And when she finished, Clara sat with her hands folded around her teacup and looked at the middle distance for a while. "What are you going to do?" Clara asked. "I am going to work here as we agreed," Pearl said. "I promised you that and I meant it. I owe you that much and probably more." "Pearl," Clara said, with the patient firmness of someone who has been through enough of life to distinguish between obligation and foolishness. "I offered you work because I thought you needed somewhere to go. I did not intend for it to be a life sentence. It has been 2 weeks since I met him. Your mother met your father at a church social and told my mother that same evening that she had met the man she would marry," Clara said. "Your mother was very seldom wrong about things." Pearl looked at her aunt. "I do not want to be foolish," she said. "I am 26 years old and I have been managing my own life since I was 18, and I have made good decisions on the whole." "This is true," Clara said, "and yet you crossed the Rocky Mountains with a broken compass." Pearl opened her mouth and then she closed it again because there was genuinely nothing to say to that. She stayed in Boise through November. She worked for Clara and she was good at it: the sewing, the alterations, the fitting of women who came in with fabric they had ordered from catalogs and visions in their heads that needed someone careful to realize. She liked the work. She liked Clara. She liked the town, which was small but alive with the particular energy of a place that was becoming something, the territory pushing toward statehood one argument at a time. She wrote to Silas in the second week of November. She had been composing the letter in her head since the stage pulled away from Harlow Creek, and when she finally sat down to write it, the words came easily, which told her something. She told him she had arrived safely, told him about the work with Clara, told him about Boise's particular character, the territorial legislature meeting in a building that had been a saloon 3 years before, the mixed population of miners and ranchers and merchants, and the growing number of families who were building houses with glass windows and proper chimneys, the long, clean view of the mountains on clear days that made her think, with a frequency she was not going to mention, of a particular valley considerably to the east. She did not tell him she thought about him every day because she was practicing caution. She sealed the letter and posted it and told herself the 3 weeks it would take to get a reply were a reasonable waiting period for a person cultivating patience. His reply came in 12 days, which meant he had written back within a day or two of receiving her letter. She noticed this and tried not to draw conclusions from it. The letter was written in a clear, precise hand that surprised her slightly. She had not imagined him as a man whose handwriting showed that kind of care, and it was longer than she had expected. He told her about the cattle, about the fence situation with George Bentley, which had come to a resolution of sorts when the county surveyor had come out and confirmed Bentley's papers were correct, and the association had backed down, grumbling. He told her that the first real snow of the season had come and covered the valley 4 inches deep, and that the elk had been coming down from the high timber earlier than usual, which he thought meant a hard winter. He told her that Mrs. Alderton sent her regards, which Pearl found charming. And at the end, in the same careful handwriting, he said, "I find that I think about that morning on the porch considerably more than a sensible man with a ranch to run would think it wise to admit." Pearl read this sentence 4 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer with her Aunt Clara's letter, which was where she kept things that mattered, and went back to work. They wrote through December. The letters grew longer. She told him about her family, her father, who had died when she was 15, the fever that had taken him the same year the drought took the crops, the years after when she and her mother had managed alone until her mother's own death in 1879, and how she had been truly alone since then, in the particular way that being without family makes a person alone regardless of how many other people are around. He wrote back about his own history with a frankness that she thought must have cost him something. His family in Tennessee. His father, who had fought in the war and come back from it, changed in ways that could not be spoken of directly. The way Texas had felt too full of old grievances after the war, the way riding north with the trail herd had felt like choosing a direction for himself for the first time. By January, their letters had stopped being merely newsy and informative, and had become something else: conversations, really, conducted across 300 miles of winter territory. She found herself thinking of things during the day: a customer with an interesting history, something Clara said, the way the mountains looked in the January cold, and thinking immediately after, I want to tell him that. In February, when the snow was deepest and Boise was blue and still in the early mornings, she wrote a letter that she had been working toward for weeks. She told him what she had felt on that porch watching the snow. She told him that the directness of it had frightened her, because she was not a woman who trusted sudden feelings, on account of having learned through painful experience that sudden feelings could lead a person into choices that looked beautiful in the snow and then had to be lived with in every other kind of weather. She told him that she was, however, no longer certain. She was afraid. She posted it and then spent 2 weeks in a state of anxiety that she managed with the rigorous application of work, which had always been her best remedy for anything. His reply, when it came, was the shortest letter he had written. It said, I have been afraid of the same thing for the same reasons, and I stopped being afraid sometime around December. I am not suggesting anything impractical, but I am saying that if you wanted to see this valley in the spring, it is remarkable when the snow comes off and the meadow grass comes up. You would have your own room proper, and Mrs. Alderton would be present, and you would be perfectly at liberty to leave at any time. I am not a man who traps things. Pearl read this and felt something unlock in her chest, slowly, and with a certainty that she trusted precisely because it was not sudden. She went to find Clara. Clara was in the workroom pinning a hem, and she looked up when Pearl came in and took one look at her face and set down her pins. Tell me, she said. Pearl told her. Clara listened without interrupting, which was a sign of how seriously she was taking it. Do you want to go? Clara said when Pearl finished. Yes, Pearl said. Then go, Clara said. Pearl, I did not spend 20 years building something of my own just to watch my niece waste herself on caution she does not actually feel. Your mother was the cautious one of us too. It did not always serve her well. Pearl looked at her aunt. I feel as though I should say something about practicality. You have been practical your entire adult life, Clara said. Go and be impractical. You are allowed. Pearl went in April when the passes were clear and the land was beginning to breathe again after winter. She took the stage back to Harlow Creek, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon with Duchess, whom she had retrieved from the Boise livery in February and who had spent the winter in considerably better accommodations than Pearl, tied to the back, and she sent a telegram to Silas from the depot that said simply, Stage, Tuesday, Harlow Creek. He was at the stage depot when it arrived. He was standing in the same spot where she had last seen him, which she chose to believe was not a coincidence, but which she also knew might be. He was wearing a clean shirt and his good hat, and when the stage door opened and Pearl stepped out, he looked at her with an expression that was everything he had not been saying in letters for 5 months, and Pearl looked back at him with what she suspected was much the same expression. And they stood like that for a moment in the April sunlight while the stage driver unloaded luggage and the drummer from her first journey came out behind her with his too small suit and stepped around them without noticing he was walking through a significant moment. You came, Silas said. I did, Pearl said. She looked at him, really looked, the way you cannot look at a person through letters no matter how good the letters are. He was the same and also more real, more solid, more present than her memory of him had been, which her memory had not done a bad job of preserving. There were more lines around his eyes than she remembered. The careful expression was there, but gentler, opened by something. How was the journey? He asked. The compass worked this time, she said. I checked before I left. Something caught in his expression, warmth and the edge of laughter together. "Good," he said. He loaded her things into the wagon he had brought and they drove back to the valley, and it was exactly as he had described it. The snow gone from the meadows but still white on the high peaks, the grass coming up in that particular bright green of early spring that is almost too vivid to be credible, the creek running high with melt and shining, and the ranch house with its porch and the smoke from the chimney and the horses moving in the corral. Pearl stood on the porch where she had stood in the October snow and looked at the valley and felt something she recognized, after a moment's examination, as the feeling of arriving somewhere. Mrs. Alderton was waiting inside with a meal prepared and the table set properly, and she looked at Pearl with the sharp blue eyes and said, "You stayed away too long," which Pearl thought was possibly the most direct and satisfying welcome she had ever received. They spent 3 days in a kind of careful happiness, navigating the new reality of actual presence after months of letters, which is always a relearning even between people who know each other well. Silas showed her the ranch properly, the upper pastures, the forest edge where the timber line was, the creek where he had built a small weir to manage the water flow to the east pasture. He was a thoughtful steward of the land, she saw, not in the romantic sense but in the practical sense of a man who understood that the land was not his to take from but to work with, and that taking care of it was the same thing as taking care of himself. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father's horses, and the way the hills looked in autumn, about the school she had attended until 14, where the teacher had been a young woman from Ohio who had taught Pearl to love books as a survival tool and not merely a luxury. She told him about the years after her father's death, the practical hard years of stretching what little money there was, the gradual accumulation of skills that people would pay for sewing, plain cooking, basic nursing, the odd job of school teaching when a settlement needed a temporary one. On the 4th evening she was sitting on the porch after supper watching the sky go dark over the peaks, a shawl around her shoulders against the spring cold, when Silas came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside her and said, without any preliminary, "I would like to ask you something important." Pearl took her coffee. "All right," she said. "I am not a man who believes in doing things in halves," he said. "I think I have been direct enough in my letters that this is not a surprise to you, but I want to be entirely clear in person because letters can always be interpreted charitably, and sometimes they should not be." He was looking straight ahead, the careful expression firmly in place, but she could see the effort it was costing him, which was precisely what made it meaningful. "I am 32 years old. I have this ranch and it is mine outright, no debt, no claims against it. It is hard work and it is isolated, and the winters are longer than I told you in the letters. There are things about this life that are not easy." "I know," Pearl said. "I am also," he continued, "very much in love with you. I did not intend for it to happen in 3 days in October, but it did, and 5 months of letters have not changed that in any direction except to make it considerably more solid." He turned and looked at her. "I am asking you to marry me, Pearl. Not because you need somewhere to go or because you are stranded or because it is practical, but because I want a life that includes you in it, specifically, and I cannot think of any other honest way to say that." Pearl looked at him. She had been Pearl Sawyer for 26 years, and she had become, in those years, a person who was careful with trust and careful with hope, because she had learned early that both of them, misplaced, could cost more than a person could easily afford. She had crossed the Rocky Mountains alone with a broken compass. She had sorted through the mathematics of risk and loss and probability in letters written in her aunt's kitchen in the blue Boise mornings. She had come back in April not because she had decided it was the right thing to do, but because, after 5 months of honest examination, she could not find an honest reason not to. "Yes," she said. It came out simply, with a certainty that surprised even her with its completeness. "Yes, Silas, I will marry you." He breathed out, slow and even, and she realized he had been holding his breath, and this man who was never flustered and never unguarded was holding his breath waiting for her answer, and she felt a rush of tenderness for this that was almost overwhelming. He reached out and took her right hand, which was closer, holding the coffee cup, and held it with the same care with which he had touched her shoulder in the October snow, careful and deliberate and meaning it. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one over the peaks, and Pearl thought that there were not many moments in a life that felt exactly right while they were happening, but that this was one of them. They were married in June at the small church in Harlow Creek, which held perhaps 40 people at capacity, and was full to the door on account of the fact that Silas Lawson was liked in the valley, with the particular respect that competent and fair men accumulate in places where both qualities are scarce. Pearl wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding weeks from blue wool she had sent for from Boise, and Clara came up from Boise for the occasion, and sat in the front row with the expression of a woman who has been right about something, and is taking quiet pleasure in it without making a production of it. Reverend Marsh was a small man with magnificent whiskers and a tendency toward the biblical dramatic, and his sermon before the ceremony went on considerably longer than Silas had perhaps hoped for. But Pearl found it charming in the way that the excesses of occasion can be charming when the occasion itself is genuinely happy. Cutter sat in the third row looking scrubbed and formal and slightly awed, and George Bentley, his fence problems resolved, sat beside his wife and nodded at Pearl when she came down the aisle in a way that felt like a particular kind of blessing. They exchanged their vows in the straightforward manner of the Methodist tradition, and when Reverend Marsh pronounced them married, and Silas turned to Pearl with that unlocked expression that she now knew was specifically for her, she thought that 3 days in October and 5 months of letters and a broken compass had led her, by the most improbable route, to exactly the right place. The summer was a working one, as all summers on a cattle ranch are working ones. Pearl learned the rhythms of the Lawson Ranch with the systematic thoroughness she had always applied to new knowledge. The cycles of the cattle, the management of the pastures, the particular demands of hay season when everyone and everything on the ranch worked from first light to last. She was not decorative, and she did not pretend to be. She mended tack. She kept accounts, taking over from Silas a ledger that had been maintained with evident reluctance, and a great deal of crossed-out arithmetic. She rode fence lines, and she helped with the doctoring of cattle when that was needed, which proved to require less sentiment and more pragmatism than she had expected. Mrs. Alderton, who had been a fixture of the ranch for 4 years, welcomed Pearl with a clear-eyed practicality that Pearl interpreted correctly as approval. The two of them established an understanding that was less like employer and employee, and more like two women with complementary skills, running a complex household with shared purpose. They did not always agree on everything, and said so directly, and this mutual directness became the foundation of a friendship that surprised them both. The fence dispute, the one that had taken Silas and Pearl to George Bentley's in October, had been only one expression of a larger tension in the territory between the large cattle associations and the smaller independent ranchers. That summer of 1883, there were incidents in other parts of Wyoming that Pearl read about in the newspaper that came by mail: threats, occasional violence, the quiet economic pressure of large outfits controlling the water sources that smaller ones needed. Silas navigated this carefully, maintaining relationships with the valley's other independent ranchers and homesteaders, and contributing to the informal network of support and information that was the only real protection small operators had. Pearl watched him do this and understood that what she had seen in October, the man who rode to his neighbor's aid without being asked and without making much of it, was not occasional but characteristic. It was simply who he was, the same way the Walden on the bookshelf and the careful handwriting and the breaking into open laughter when the moment genuinely earned it were who he was. She thought, not for the first time that summer, that she had been extraordinarily lucky in her broken compass, because without it she might have missed this entirely. In September, Pearl discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days, not out of anxiety, or not only out of anxiety, but out of the particular wonder of it, turning the fact over in her mind like a stone with an unexpected weight. On the third evening she told Silas at supper, quietly and directly, without ceremony, because that was the language they had developed together. He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. He did not say anything else for several minutes, and Pearl watched the thing moving through his face, feeling he was allowing himself slowly, the way a fire builds from a careful start, and she squeezed his hand and watched him and felt a happiness so clean and grounded that it was almost indistinguishable from peace. "We should write to your aunt," he said eventually. "First thing tomorrow," Pearl said. "Tonight I thought we might just sit with it for a little while." He looked at her with that unlocked expression. "Yes," he said, "tonight we can just sit with it." The pregnancy was unremarkable in the best sense of that word. Pearl was healthy, and the work of the ranch kept her so, and she continued doing nearly everything she normally did with the exception of the heavier fence work, which she conceded reluctantly on Mrs. Alderton's strong advice, and her own eventual admission that Mrs. Alderton was right. She read everything she could find on the management of a pregnancy, which in the medical literature available in 1883 was simultaneously more and less useful than she had hoped, and she wrote to Clara weekly and received detailed letters back that contained a mixture of practical advice, family stories, and the particular warmth of a woman who had wanted children of her own and found a different kind of maternal investment available to her. Silas built a cradle. He worked on it in the evenings through the autumn, with a care and thoroughness that Pearl observed from the armchair she had claimed by the fire, and that moved her more than she could have entirely articulated. He was not a carpenter by training, but he was methodical and patient, and he used good pine from the timber on the east slope, and he sanded it smooth over many evenings with the same steady attention he gave everything. And when it was done, it was a good solid thing with curved runners and a small carved pattern along the headboard pine branches. She realized, looking closely, with small cones on them, which was a piece of whimsy that she would not have predicted from him, and which delighted her accordingly. On a cold morning in early February, 1884, their son was born. Mrs. Alderton had a steady and experienced hand in this, and Pearl had her Aunt Clara, who had come up from Boise a month before and intended to stay through March, and Cutter rode 10 miles to bring the doctor from Harlow Creek, who arrived 2 hours after the whole thing was already concluded. The boy was large and loud and entirely himself from the first moment, with a shock of dark hair that matched his father's and eyes that were, Pearl insisted, already showing signs of brown, though Silas said it was too early to tell. They named him Thomas James Lawson, after Pearl's father and Silas's elder brother, who had died of disease in 1876, and who Silas had loved with the deep, uncomplicated love of siblings who understand each other without much needing to speak. The naming of the boy after him was a thing Silas had proposed quietly, and Pearl had accepted with immediate agreement, because she understood precisely what it meant to name someone after a person you had lost. Thomas James Lawson turned out to be a person of considerable opinions from a very early age. He had a voice that could fill the entire ranch house, and a curiosity so large and persistent that it regularly outpaced his ability to be in only one location at a time, which became relevant as soon as he could walk. He had his father's steadiness in some moods, and his mother's absolute refusal to be redirected in others, and he was, from the beginning, adored by everyone on the property, including the horses, who tolerated his early, clumsy approaches with a patience that said something about Silas's work with them. Clara went back to Boise in March and came back at Christmas, and the pattern of her visits became a fixture of the year. She was never not Pearl's aunt, with all the particular independence that implied, but she was also something like a grandmother to Thomas and a genuine friend to Silas, who she regarded with the specific approval she reserved for people who did exactly what they said they would do. The spring of 1885 brought both difficulty and resolution. The large cattle association that had been the source of the fence troubles 2 years before made another attempt at the valley, this time through a legal challenge to a water right that several of the valley ranchers, including Silas, shared from the creek. The legal challenge was designed to be expensive and exhausting, the kind of fight that drains a small operator dry before the court ever rules. Pearl, who had been keeping the ranch accounts with increasing sophistication, recognized the strategy immediately, and said so at the meeting of valley ranchers that Silas called in their kitchen one March evening, with 14 men seated at the table and along the walls and Mrs. Alderton's coffee disappearing at a rate that spoke to the tension in the room. "They do not expect to win in court," Pearl said, from the end of the table where she had been sitting quietly with the account books open before her. "They expect you to run out of money before you can fight it properly. The goal is not the legal outcome. The goal is the expense." There was a silence in the room. A few of the men looked at each other with the slight discomfort of men, not entirely accustomed to having a woman lay out the strategic situation at what they had perhaps imagined would be a male conversation. Then George Bentley said, "She is right," with the flat certainty of a man who had his own experience with association tactics, and the discomfort shifted into something more useful. The outcome of that meeting was a collective legal defense fund, each rancher contributing what they could, pooling the resources to hire a proper lawyer from Cheyenne who knew territorial water law, and presenting the association with a unified opposition that was rather more expensive to fight than they had apparently anticipated. The case took 8 months and cost everyone something, but it was resolved in the ranchers' favor in November 1885 by a territorial judge who read the water rights documentation with evident care and did not find in favor of parties who could not produce a clear claim. Silas came home from Cheyenne with the judgment in his coat pocket and told Pearl over supper, in the same tone of voice he used to report fence repairs and hay yields. She read the document carefully twice and then looked up at him and said, "I think this calls for something better than coffee." He produced a bottle of whiskey that he had been keeping in the back of the sideboard, and they had a small glass each at the kitchen table after Thomas was asleep and Mrs. Alderton had gone home for the evening, and Pearl raised her glass to him and said, "Your father would have been proud of you." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I hope so. I did not always know how to make him proud, but this," he looked at the document at the room at her. "Yes, I think so." By the spring of 1886, the valley had settled into a relative peace. The association had not entirely given up, and the larger tensions of the territorial range wars were not over. They would not be, not for years, but this particular valley, with its informal community of ranchers who had learned by necessity to coordinate and defend collectively, had achieved a stability that was not guaranteed but was genuinely earned. The Lawson Ranch was in the best shape it had ever been. The cattle numbers were up, the herd quality had improved with careful breeding decisions Silas had made over the previous 2 years, and the financial picture that Pearl maintained in the account ledger showed, for the first time, a comfortable margin. Comfortable not in the sense of luxury, this was never going to be that kind of life, but in the sense of security, of having something solid to stand on. Thomas, now 2 years old, was a force of nature in miniature. He had discovered horses with the passion of someone who believes they have found their purpose, and he spent a large portion of every day at the corral fence watching his father work with them, and a smaller but significant portion trying to climb over said fence, which Silas had addressed by beginning to take him into the corral on a lead rope with one of the gentler horses, an older gray mare named Sophie, who bore the boy's enthusiastic interest with magnificent tolerance. Pearl watched these sessions from the porch with her coffee, and the warmth that filled her watching them, the big man and the small boy and the patient old horse moving in the morning light, Silas's voice low and steady as always, Thomas's high excited commentary on everything he observed, was the kind of warmth that is not dramatic, but is the most sustaining kind, the everyday ordinary deep happiness that is so much better than its intermittent, spectacular cousin. She was happy in a way she had not known she could be, not because she had been unhappy before, but because she had not understood that a happiness this grounded was available, that it was not a thing that happened to other kinds of people, but was in fact the ordinary result of finding the right place and the right person, and being willing to build something together with real material and real effort, and enough honesty to hold up in all the different kinds of weather. In the late summer of 1886, Pearl wrote a letter to an old friend from Missouri, a woman named Ruth who had been her closest companion through the difficult years after her father's death, and in it she said, "I want to tell you something I could not have told you when I was younger, because I would not have believed it then. I was not looking for this life when I found it. I was looking for Boise, and I went the wrong way, and I ended up in a valley in Wyoming on a man's property, and he said, without being unkind, that my broken compass explained how I had gotten there. And I thought then that he was right. But I think now that the compass was not broken in the way I understood broken to mean. It was pointing somewhere I did not know I wanted to go, and it got me there." Ruth wrote back a month later and said, "Pearl Sawyer, you have always been the most practical person I have ever known, and this is the first time I have meant that entirely as a compliment." Pearl read this letter to Silas on the porch one autumn evening, in the same season they had met 3 years before, the aspens along the creek going gold, and the sky, the sharp cloudless blue that Wyoming territory produced in October, as if in compensation for everything else. Silas listened to the letter with his eyes on the middle distance and a slight curve at the corner of his mouth. "An impractical person," he said. "That is accurate." "I thought so," Pearl said. "For what it is worth," he said, turning to look at her, "I have never thought the compass was entirely broken. No. A broken compass that takes a person 300 miles in the wrong direction and lands them exactly where they need to be," he said, "seems to me more like a compass with a different idea of right." He paused. "That may be too philosophical for October." Pearl looked at him across the 3 years of their life together, across the letters and the spring return, and the summer, and the wedding and Thomas and the fence wars, and all the ordinary days that were the substance of it. And she thought that this man, who had been a stranger on a porch step on a gray October morning in 1882, was the most familiar person in the world to her now. And that this transition from total stranger to most known was the most remarkable thing she had ever participated in, more remarkable than crossing the Rocky Mountains, more remarkable than any practical achievement she had managed. "It is not too philosophical," she said. "It is exactly right." He reached over and took her hand, the way he did, with that same careful deliberateness that had never become automatic, still chosen, every time, and they sat on the porch in the October light and watched the aspens moving in the slight wind off the mountain. And Thomas's voice came from inside the house, where Mrs. Alderton was giving him supper, that high clear voice narrating something at great length, and the horses moved in the corral, and the valley lay all around them like something cupped in 2 hands. In the winter of 1887, Pearl found that she was pregnant again. She was 30 years old and Thomas was not yet 3, and she sat with this knowledge in the same chair by the fire where she had sat with Thomas's expectation, and felt the same wonder, different only in that it was informed now by the knowledge of what came next, the weight of it, the arrival of a person, the perpetual astonishment of watching someone become themselves. She told Silas in the same way she had told him the first time, over supper directly, because that was their language and she could not imagine using a different one. He responded in the same way he had responded before: stillness, then the taking of her hand, then a silence that was full rather than empty. Then he said, with the slight roughness of a man feeling something too large for easy words, "Thomas is going to take this badly." Pearl laughed. "He will come around when he understands what a younger brother means." "Brother," Silas said. "Or sister," Pearl said. "I have no information either way." "I have a feeling," he said. "You had a feeling about the hay yield last August and you were wrong by 40 bales." "I am better with people than with hay," he said. And the smile that had come in fully when he said it was the smile Pearl thought of, years later, when she thought of the specific texture of happiness in these years. Their daughter was born in August of 1887 on a night when the heat lay flat and golden over the valley, and the stars came out so thick and bright they seemed closer than usual, as if the sky had been drawn down. She was smaller than Thomas had been and quieter in the first moments, looking around with a focus that the attending doctor, who had made it in time on this occasion, called remarkable for a newborn. They named her Anna Clara Lawson, the second name for Pearl's aunt, who received the news in a letter and wrote back with a response that was the most emotional thing Pearl had ever received from a woman who conducted most of her inner life with extreme privacy. Clara came up from Boise in September, and she held her namesake with the careful tenderness of someone handling something very precious. And Pearl watched her aunt's face and understood what this meant to her in a way that did not require anything to be said. Thomas adjusted to his sister with the speed of a child who discovers that a new person means a new audience, and he took immediately to narrating the world to her: the horses, the weather, the operations of the ranch, with the thorough authority of a 3-year-old who believes himself an expert on most things. Anna regarded him from the beginning with an expression that somehow suggested she was taking notes. The years shaped themselves around the work, and the seasons, and the growth of the children, and the deepening of the life. The ranch expanded modestly. Silas bought the parcel of land to the north in 1888, adding another 300 acres that connected to the timber and gave them summer grazing he had been renting from a neighbor. Pearl continued the accounts with the precision she had brought to them from the start, and she also, when Thomas was old enough for it, began teaching him his letters and numbers with the same books she had learned from, and some new ones ordered from a publisher in Chicago. She wrote to Clara every week and saw her twice a year, at Christmas and in summer, and she exchanged letters with Ruth in Missouri, and with 2 women she had met through the valley's informal social network. The wives and daughters of the other ranchers and homesteaders, women who were building lives in the same hard and rewarding territory with the same practical determination. They met when they could, these women, for the practical exchanges of information: seeds, recipes, medical knowledge, the management of common difficulties, but also for the less practical and equally vital exchange of conversation and company, because isolation was a real condition of the frontier life, and the women who navigated it best were the ones who found each other. In the spring of 1889, Wyoming Territory moved toward statehood, and the debates about what that would mean for land rights, for the water disputes, for the political balance between the large associations and the independent operators, ran through every conversation in the valley with the sustained attention that political questions earn when they have direct material consequences. Pearl followed these debates with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, and she had opinions which she expressed in the kitchen, at the valley meetings, in the letters she wrote. Silas listened to her opinions with the same attention he gave everything important, and more than once she saw him present an argument to George Bentley or Cutter, or at a Harlow Creek meeting that had originated with minor modifications at their kitchen table. She pointed this out to him once. "You are better at arguments than I am," he said, without any defensiveness. "You get to the center of them faster. Why would I not use that?" Pearl looked at him. because some men would consider it a loss of something to acknowledge that their wife thinks more clearly than they do about certain things. Those men, Silas said, are fools. He said it with the simple finality he used for things he considered settled, and Pearl felt the same warmth she had felt the first morning she had watched him with the young horse in the corral, the recognition of a person who understood power correctly, not as a territory to defend, but as a capacity to be used well. Wyoming was admitted to the Union in July 1890, becoming the 44th state, and the occasion was marked in Harlow Creek with a celebration that drew people from the whole valley. A day of considerable noise and festivity with music and food and speeches from men who were mostly less eloquent than they believed themselves to be. And Thomas, 6 years old, watched the whole thing with an attention that suggested he was assessing how these proceedings ought to have been organized, which he got from both parents in Pearl's honest estimation. Anna, at 3, spent most of the celebration trying to follow a dog that had attended the festivities uninvited, and was ultimately successful. And the dog came home with them and was named Biscuit and lived on the ranch for 11 years and was in many ways a more consistent presence than most people. On an October evening in 1890, October, always their month, the month that had made them and that the calendar continued to return them to like a compass finding its point, Pearl was sitting on the porch as she had on so many October evenings before, watching the aspens, watching the sky. Silas came out and sat beside her with his coffee. Thomas's voice came from inside, reading to Anna from one of the picture books that Clara had sent from Boise. Biscuit lay at the edge of the porch with his chin on his paws. "Do you remember," Pearl said, "the first morning you came out of the door and I was on Duchess and you said I was on your property?" "I remember," Silas said. "You were not very welcoming." "I was welcoming enough," he said. "I offered you coffee and a housekeeper. After you told me, my compass explained my presence." "It did explain your presence," he said, with the dry certainty that was one of the things she loved most about how his mind worked. "It did," Pearl admitted. 8 years ago." 8 years, he said, with the quiet weight of a man actually measuring it. "Do you ever think about it, that it was an accident, that if the compass had been working I would have gone to Boise directly and we would never have met?" Silas was quiet for a moment, looking at the aspens moving in the evening wind. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "I used to think it in terms of luck. I'm not sure I still think of it that way." "What way do you think of it?" "I think a man who is going to meet the person he is meant for meets them," he said slowly, not as something he had prepared but as something he was working out as he said it. "Through one door or another." The compass was just the door. He looked at her. "I cannot prove that. It may just be a story I tell myself to feel better about the fact that it was almost a very different life." "I like that story," Pearl said. "So do I," he said. The stars were beginning to appear, the first ones only, testing the evening. The mountain peaks were dark cutouts against the last light. Inside, Thomas had finished reading and now was asking Anna a question, his voice carrying that particular inflection of a child who believes the question to be very important. And Anna's response was too quiet to hear, but generated some kind of negotiation. Pearl leaned slightly into Silas's shoulder, not quite resting against him but making contact, the long, familiar closeness of a life shared in all its detail. He put his arm around her without looking away from the mountains, as natural as breathing. "I thought about something today," Pearl said, "when I was going over the accounts. We have enough now to send Thomas to a proper school in Cheyenne when the time comes, if that is what he wants." "He will want horses," Silas said. "He can want horses and have an education. Those are not in conflict." Pearl paused. "I did not have the education I wanted. I do not want that for him or for Anna." "No," Silas said, "neither do I." He tightened his arm slightly around her. "We will make it happen." "I know we will," Pearl said. It was not confidence or bravado. It was just the plain assessment of what they had proven themselves capable of over 8 years of building together, from a broken compass and a gray morning, and a man on a porch step who had the good sense not to send her away. The evening deepened and the stars came fully out, and the valley below the porch was dark and breathing, the creek somewhere out there in the darkness making its constant sound, and the mountains stood against the sky as they had stood for 10,000 years before two people chose this particular piece of them. And the house behind Pearl and Silas was warm and lit, and filled with the sound of children and the small, ordinary noises of a life fully lived. And Pearl Sawyer, Pearl Lawson now. Both names hers in different ways, belonging to different chapters of a single self, sat in the October dark, with the man she had stumbled upon entirely by accident, or by the navigation of a compass. That knew something its needle was not telling and felt, with a certainty so deep and settled that it was no longer even something she had to name, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The broken compass sat on the mantelpiece inside the house. Silas had retrieved it from her coat pocket the morning she rode in, and she had told him he could throw it out, and he had said nothing and kept it instead, and she had found it there one afternoon after they married and understood that this was one of the things about him, that he kept the objects of significant things, not sentimentally exactly, but as a kind of testimony, a physical acknowledgement that certain moments had been real and had mattered. The needle still spun in its cracked glass face, pointing nowhere and everywhere at once. Pearl had stopped thinking of it as broken. She thought of it now the way Silas had said he thought of it, as a door. One that had been open exactly long enough for her to walk through it, and had then closed quietly behind her, with no need to open again, because there was nowhere else she wanted to go. Thomas came to the porch door and said, with the practicality of someone who had his father's delivery, "Anna says she will not go to sleep without the story about the horse that could count." Silas looked at Pearl. "That is your story," Pearl said. "I told the one about the rabbit last night." Silas looked slightly aggrieved in the comfortable way of a man who is not actually aggrieved. He set down his coffee and stood and went inside, and Pearl heard his voice begin the story in the low, steady tone he used for everything he meant, and Anna's small laugh at the familiar beginning, and Thomas's superior voice pointing out what his father had changed from the last telling. Pearl sat in the October dark and looked at the stars and the mountains and the valley and the creek she could hear but not see, and she breathed in the cold, clean air that smelled of pine and coming autumn and the particular mineral freshness of high country, and she was deeply, completely, irreversibly happy. In the years that followed, the valley grew and changed, and the Lawson ranch grew and changed with it, but the essential things, the work and the care and the honesty and the long conversations on the porch, and the letters that kept coming because Pearl never stopped writing them and never stopped loving the practice of putting things into words. Those things remained, as stable as the mountains and as sustaining as the creek. Thomas did go to school in Cheyenne at 14, and he did love horses, and he managed to pursue both interests simultaneously with the determined resourcefulness of a person who had learned from parents that wanting two things was not a contradiction, but simply a larger ambition. He came home in summers and holidays and grew into a young man who had his father's steady practical intelligence and his mother's absolute refusal to be deterred by complications. And he was, in Pearl's daily assessment, a person she would have admired even if he were not her son. Anna grew into a child, and then a young woman of formidable quietness and formidable interior life, who read everything Pearl had read and more, and who had an analytical mind that attacked problems from angles that surprised even Pearl, and who went, at 15, to a school for girls in Denver that Clara helped identify and partially fund, and who wrote home letters that were already, at 15, the letters of someone who had things to say. Clara died in 1895, quietly and at home, of a heart that had been giving her trouble for 2 years, but that she had managed with characteristic discretion. She was 65, which was not young but was not old enough, and Pearl received the news in a letter from Clara's neighbor and sat with it for a long time in the kitchen before she went to find Silas. He held her while she cried, one of the few times in all their years together that Pearl cried in front of him, and he said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say, which was the right understanding. She went to Boise for the funeral and settled Clara's affairs, and came home with a box of her aunt's things, and the feeling of having lost something that had been quietly essential for most of her life. She sat the box on the table when she came home, and she sat down in her kitchen, and Silas put coffee on the stove and sat across from her and said, "Tell me about her." And Pearl told him. She told him everything she could think of, everything she remembered: the young woman who had come west with her husband and stayed when she did not have to, the sharp eyes and the direct speech and the dressmaking business built from nothing, the visit in Boise when Pearl had been trying to be cautious about a man she had met for 3 days in a broken compass valley, and Clara had said, "Go and be impractical. You are allowed." She was the reason, Pearl said. Not the only reason, but part of it. "I know," Silas said. "I always knew it. I am glad I got to thank her properly." Before he stopped, Pearl looked at him. "You thanked her?" "At the wedding," he said. "I told her that she had done the work of getting you here and that I was grateful and that I intended to be worth it." Pearl looked at her husband across the table, this man she had known for 13 years now, this man whose face was as familiar to her as her own and more beloved, and she thought that there were still things he surprised her with, and that this capacity to surprise her, not in unsettling ways but in the ways of depth gradually revealed, was one of the specific gifts of a long and honest life with another person. "Were you," she said, "worth it?" He looked at her without evasion, directly, the brown eyes that she had wondered about in the gray light of that first morning. "That," he said, "is a question I think about every day. I try to be." Pearl reached across the table and took his hand. "You are," she said, "you are Silas." Outside, the October sun was doing what it always did, going down over the mountains in that extravagant western way, spilling color across the sky in quantities that seemed almost excessive, and the valley was golden and still, and the aspens along the creek were lit from within with their annual fire, and Biscuit barked once from the yard at something only dogs could detect, and somewhere in the house a door opened and closed as the afternoon breathed through it. Pearl Lawson, born Pearl Sawyer in Missouri in 1856, who had crossed the Rocky Mountains alone with a broken compass in October of 1882, and ended up on a stranger's property and found, in the course of that ending up, the entirety of the life she had not known she was looking for, sat at her kitchen table in Wyoming in the autumn light and held her husband's hand and was whole. The compass on the mantelpiece sat in its cracked glass case, the needle still and for once pointing, if you tilted it just right, and the light came through the window at the proper angle, somewhere remarkably close to north.